Some monsters are born, others are made. But the worst kind, they're inherited. A curse, slithering through bloodlines, lurking in the shadows, waiting to sink its claws into its next victim. And in Wolfman, that horror doesn't just haunt the night, it stalks it. A creature so eerie, so unnervingly unnatural, it didn't just terrify audiences, it defined an entire genre. So brace yourself, because we're about to dive headfirst into the nightmare that started it all. In the dense, misty wilderness of Oregon, 1995, a sense of unease spread through the region. A hiker had vanished without a trace, and whispers of a strange virus lurking in the wild took hold. But for Grady Lovell, a hardened hunter, the real danger was something far worse. One cold evening, perched in a hunting blind with his young son Blake, Grady peered through his rifle scope, his breath hitching as he caught sight of something unnatural sprinting through the trees. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear, whatever it was, it moved too fast. He pulled the trigger, but the shot was lost in the emptiness of the forest. Tension hung thick between father and son. Grady's harsh ways left Blake uneasy, especially as his father's voice crackled over the radio, barking orders with an intensity that made the boy's hands tremble. Whatever they had seen that night, neither of them would forget it. 30 years later, far from the shadowy forests of his childhood, Blake had built a life of stability in the bustling heart of San Francisco. A devoted husband and father, he tried to leave his past behind, but something restless still lingered in him, something he couldn't shake. One afternoon, while out with his daughter, Ginger, an unsettling encounter disrupted their peace. A stranger on the street muttered something cruel, something dark. Without hesitation, Blake stepped between them, shielding his daughter from the man's aggression. His protective instincts flared, but so did something else. A spark of rage, primal and uncontrollable. Ginger recoiled at her father's sudden change, tears welling in her eyes as his voice, sharp and unfamiliar, lashed out in anger. Realizing his mistake, Blake softened, kneeling to comfort her, but the moment left an aftertaste of dread. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, an official document lay on the table before them. After decades of uncertainty, it was now confirmed. Grady Lovell was dead. The past was finally buried, or so Blake thought, but death has a way of leaving things unfinished. And some things, some curses, never stay buried for long. The silence between them was suffocating. Blake had carried the weight of unspoken words for too long, but now he couldn't ignore them anymore. When he walked into Charlotte's workplace the next day, the tension hung thick in the air. Their marriage felt like a thread fraying at the edges, and Ginger, caught between them, felt more distant than ever. Something had to change. Blake suggested the farm, his father's old land. A place untouched by time, isolated from the distractions of the world. It could be their chance to start over, to reconnect. Charlotte hesitated but agreed. They needed this. By the time they packed up and set off, the sky stretched vast and gray above them, the towering trees of Oregon looming in the distance like silent sentinels. The deeper they drove into the forest, the more the road twisted into something unfamiliar. It felt endless, the trees pressing closer, the path narrowing until it simply stopped, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Then came the movement. A shadow perched high in the old hunting blind, the very place Blake remembered from his childhood. A figure climbed down, stepping into the dim light. Weathered features, knowing eyes. A man who looked as though he had spent his whole life in these woods. Derek. He claimed to know the land, claimed to remember Blake's father. There was something unsettling in the way he studied them. But with no other way forward, they let him join. Night fell as they pushed onward. The truck rumbled down the uneven path, swallowed by the trees, the headlights barely slicing through the thickening fog. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. Then, a flash of movement. Something rushed across the road. Not a deer, not a bear. It moved too fast, its form wrong, its limbs too long. Before Blake could react, the truck spun out of control, skidding off the road. The world turned upside down as they plummeted down a steep hill, the vehicle smashing against the trees before finally coming to a shuddering halt. Blake's breath came fast. His mind raced. Then, Derek. He had been thrown from the truck, lying motionless on the forest floor. The night around them stirred, leaves rustled, twigs snapped, and then came the sound. A growl, low, guttural, too close. Glass shattered, claws tore through the window. Something fast, powerful, and relentless reached in, slashing across Blake's arm before seizing Derek. A scream rang out, cut short, as the man was dragged into the darkness. No time to think, no time to breathe. Blake pulled Charlotte and Ginger from the wreck, their hearts hammering against their ribs as they ran. The forest around them came alive with movement. Something was hunting them, and it wasn't going to stop. Inside the house, Charlotte worked quickly, peeling back Blake's shredded sleeve to assess the damage. The wound was deep, too deep. Blood soaked through the fabric as she wrapped his arm tightly, but something was wrong. The cut refused to clot. Blake's breath grew heavy, sweat beading along his forehead. Then, his teeth. One by one, they loosened in his mouth, the dull throb turning into sharp, pulsing pain. A molar slipped free, dropping into his palm. Then another. The floor beneath him swayed, his senses suddenly hyper-aware. Every creak in the wood, every whisper of movement. He could hear it all. A spider scuttling along the wall. The rhythmic breath of something waiting outside. A sound, a scratch, a snarl. Blake staggered toward the door, drawn to it. But before he could react, a clawed hand shot through the doggy door, curling around his ankle with a crushing grip. It had him. The world tilted as Blake was yanked downward, his nails scraping against the floor. Panic flashed through Charlotte's eyes before she grabbed the nearest weapon, a rusted hammer, and brought it down hard on the creature's arm. A sickening crack echoed through the house as the thing outside let out a guttural roar, retreating into the night. Blake slumped against the wall, his vision distorting, his ears ringing. Charlotte called his name, but the words were warped, slipping through his mind like echoes underwater. Shapes blurred, shadows bled into one another. He tried to answer, tried to hold on to reality, but the pain was consuming him. With trembling hands, he scribbled onto a scrap of paper, the letters barely legible. "I think I'm dying." Charlotte's face crumpled as she gripped his shoulders, but he couldn't focus on her anymore. His body wasn't his own. And then, the hunger struck. A primal instinct, raw and overpowering. Blake's pulse thundered in his ears as his muscles locked, his body suddenly moving on its own. Without warning, his head snapped back, his eyes darkening, and he lunged. Teeth bared, a feral snarl ripping from his throat. Charlotte stumbled backward, horror flooding her features as she watched Blake drop to his knees and gnaw at his own wound. Blood smeared across his lips as he slurped and bit at the gash, desperate, frenzied, his body craving something it wasn't supposed to. Charlotte clutched her chest, realizing Blake wasn't dying, he was changing. The night stretched on, relentless and unforgiving. Charlotte's heart pounded as she dragged Blake through the woods, his body deteriorating with every step. His breathing was ragged, his skin feverish, his eyes dark, hollow, inhuman. Ginger clung to her mother's side as they stumbled upon an abandoned truck. Behind them, the wolfman roared, the sound primal and deafening. The air reeked of blood, of earth, of something old and monstrous. They scrambled up the side of an abandoned greenhouse, glass cracking beneath their feet as they reached the top. But the wolfman wasn't far behind. It stalked them, circling below, its growl vibrating through the metal beams. Then, with a single swipe, it began to tear through the structure. The greenhouse shook, metal groaned, glass shattered, and then he moved. His body, his mind, no longer human. Without hesitation, he shoved Charlotte and Ginger to safety before turning back toward the beast. A guttural, animalistic growl tore through his throat. This wasn't about survival anymore, it was instinct. Charlotte and Ginger barely made it back to the house, their lungs heaving from exhaustion. But when Blake returned, he was no longer the man they knew. His skin had stretched, his human features barely holding together. Fur now covered his arms, his chest, his shoulders. His hands curled into something more beast than man. Then, he retched. The sound was wet, guttural, unnatural. He vomited onto the floor, and when Charlotte's eyes followed, her stomach turned. A severed finger lay in the mess. Not his. The wolfman's. Ginger took a cautious step forward, eyes wide with fear, but also hope. She called out to him, her voice small, desperate. But Blake didn't understand. His gaze, dark and predatory, locked onto his daughter. His body twitched, trembled. Then he moved. Too fast, too sudden. And for the first time, Ginger realized the truth. This wasn't her father anymore. This was something else. This wasn't just a sickness. This was a transformation. And now, Blake was lost to it. The last traces of humanity inside him crumbled. He turned toward them, his face now fully distorted, his body no longer that of a man. Feral hunger burned in his eyes. Charlotte grabbed Ginger's hand and ran. They crashed through the back door, the cold night air biting at their skin as they sprinted toward the barn. Behind them, heavy footfalls pounded against the ground. Blake was hunting them. Charlotte threw open the barn doors, pulling Ginger inside. They stumbled into the shadows, pressing themselves against the wooden beams, barely breathing. The barn was pitch black, but that didn't matter. Blake could see in the dark now. His steps were slow, predatory, deliberate. The sound of his breath filled the space, deep and inhuman. He sniffed the air, searching, knowing they were close. Then, a sharp snap. Pain exploded through Blake's leg as the bear trap clamped shut around his ankle. A furious snarl tore from his throat, echoing through the barn. Charlotte grabbed Ginger and ran, pushing forward through the darkness, knowing this was their last chance. But behind them, flesh tore, the sickening sound of teeth sinking into muscle. Blake chewed through his own foot. And then, he was coming after them again. They scrambled inside, Charlotte turning just in time to see him climbing up after them. His body was barely human anymore. His skin stretched tight over shifting bones, his eyes filled with something raw and desperate. Ginger's voice was barely a whisper. "He just wants this to end." Charlotte's hands trembled as she raised the rifle, aiming straight at the creature. Her finger hovered over the trigger. She saw something flicker in his darkened gaze. Recognition? Pain? Surrender? Her breath caught in her throat. Blake lunged. The shot rang out. For a moment, everything was still. Then Blake collapsed. They climbed down, their footsteps slow, deliberate. The rifle slipped from Charlotte's grasp as she dropped to her knees beside him. Ginger knelt too, small fingers curling over Blake's fur-covered hand. They stayed with him as the night stretched on, as the creature faded, leaving only the man behind. When the morning light broke over the valley, Charlotte and Ginger walked forward, hand in hand, to the place where Blake had once stood with his father. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the echoes of what had been and what was lost. And that's how Wolfman ends. Blake loses himself, and Charlotte is forced to act. In the end, she and Ginger walk away, forever changed. Could he have been saved? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more movie breakdowns.